I used to write from time to time and post uh, updates. I guess in the form of a diary where I would work out, various thoughts I was having against the background of what I was doing. So I think there's one about flying to Beijing for whatever reason I was flying to Beijing and I was flying to Beijing for the book fair, and the entry was about Chinese soft power, because at that time I was working on a translation that was for a state-run media company. And I believe I was flying at that time. I was being flown out by a different state-run media company, first class, everything. It was about, basically there's a deep fear of Chinese state-run soft power projection, or trying to put Chinese cultural products out there as a way to shift public opinion on China. It's mostly fake. I mean, it's that sort of process takes a lot of subtlety and elegance and a ton of money and sophistication. And for the most part, there's really no effort on the part of the Chinese state to try to do that at all. They basically burn their money on very silly things, like having me flown to Beijing to give a talk. I think I was doing there. What it is basically mostly a way to generate good publicity inside China, just kind of burnish the image of China for a Chinese audience, or for a very sympathetic already overseas audience. So, you can fly in whoever in this case and have them give a talk, and it makes, gives a sheen of kind of like a cosmopolitan sheen to what they're doing. What would otherwise be an event with just Chinese authors talking about Chinese literature. And in Chinese literature, there's a lot of talk about how to send it out into the world, how to make Chinese literature 走出去, have it go out into the world. And it's nearly impossible because of, to some extent, American efforts to shift art and literature. In the late 1970s through the 1980s and 1990s, through like the Iowa Writers Program and the State Department and CIA stranglehold over arts and culture funding, there was a shift in what was deemed good writing. So that inviting the Chinese authors to the Iowa in the 80s was sort of anointing them, these people who would be anti-communist writers without being anti-communists. And it's interesting, if you look at Taiwan, what they did there, the State Department and the CIA or whatever front organizations raised the generation of authors who were anti-communist without being anti-communist. They had anti-communist literature. It was very bad and not elegant at all. It was basically about, the horrors of collectivization, and you can imagine what anti-communist literature is. Well, the Americans said, you don't need to do that. You can just have these writers who celebrate the individual and put that individual expression as the paramount thing. The goal of literature is individual expression. But anyways, I liked writing those, but I find it slightly risky in a way, because those ideas are always half formed. Like this thing about propaganda and soft power. That's something that I haven't really thought all the way through, but put out there, and it's something that I'm not comfortable backing up. Someday it might be able to work itself into something that I write formally, but it's not there yet. So it feels kind of risky to have those ideas floating around that you might later contradict yourself on. But that's what this is intended to be, with a much smaller audience, perhaps no audience, and in a format that it can't be quickly pulled up in a online search. So the other thing that stunted those entries was they were often written around the time when I was traveling somewhere. So lots of them are about trips to wherever, China. There's one about going to Xi'an that I ended up turning into something that was published formally. But for the last 2 years now, I haven't left this city. I've been stuck in Tokyo. One of the reasons that I moved here in the first place was that it's so close to China, and that's where I found myself needing to go there very often. In 2018, 2019, I was in China 5 or 6 times a year. I got really used to making that trip, but then it stopped completely, and I've been stuck here. It's not the worst place on earth to be stuck, I realize. There are people who would be quite jealous of my situation. But this is not a city that I love. Japan is not a country that I love. I'm not a Japanophile. I think I was probably too young to have missed the first wave of Japanophilia in the West, around the time of the late 1980s. Maybe I sort of caught it a little bit. I'm not that young, but also too old to have missed the kind of subcultural otaku stuff that helped feed into online culture for people who are just slightly younger than me. Like all the people on 4chan who watch anime and whatnot. When I was a kid, we never, the only options would have been, you would have had to go to I remember when I was maybe 17, taking a drive to Calgary and going to Asian Mall, It was mostly like Chinese shops at the time, like Chinese little grocery store, and then whatever. But anyways, I remember going in there, and there was a store selling bootleg DVDs, and I bought a whole bunch of things at random. So if I was living there, I could have probably gone and bought like import bootleg anime DVDs, but it didn't have that where I lived. You would have really, the only options were like Sailor Moon or something on TV. So I was too young to catch that wave where everything was suddenly available online, and that otaku subcultures of Japan were feeding into their counterparts in the West. So, for me, Japan was a place that I was never really also because I was into China, and I was into China's modern history. There was a fair amount of, I would say, hostility towards the country. It's a bit silly if you really think about it, because it was quite often performative, especially in China that I lived in. It was sort of fun to indulge in I would say hostility towards Japan, and to make jokes. I remember that I used to go shopping for clothes at this store that had a Japanese flag painted on its doorstep. So you would have to tread on the Japanese flag every time you went in. And the kind of ironic thing is that inside the store they were selling, like, it was all fake Bape stuff and Evisu jeans. And everybody looked like they came straight from Shibuya. But so, over the past couple of years, since I can't write about China, I've sort of gone down two separate paths. The first is that project of going back through 1980s, 1990s Chinese cinema. The sort of underloved pulp films and B movies and exploitation from that time from roughly 1984 to 1992-ish, that there was very lax censorship there, and there was no audience for these films. The Chinese film industry was in the toilet. So that's sort of like a way to visit the country and think about it without actually going there. It's sort of, I say it's a nostalgic project, but obviously I wasn't there to see the movies, but I'm nostalgic for the experience of living in the country, but also watching those kind of Chinese B movies on a lazy weekday afternoon, turning on CCTV's movie channel and spending an afternoon watching something that I've never heard of. And it's also a really ripe area, a fertile ground for coming up with new novel thoughts about things, because those movies, as I've said before, nobody's ever really written about them. So anyways, don't need to talk more about that. The second path is contemplating the place that I'm in, which is Tokyo, which I knew very little about before coming, and which I've come to understand much better. I've lived here almost 7 years now. It's almost really unbelievable. I never imagined that I would ever live in Japan or in Tokyo. Or when I was a kid, like I said, going to Calgary was a big trip for me. I always wanted to, I guess, leave my small town and go out into the world, but I never thought it would be. I never thought the story would be as, I don't know, as cinematic as it turned out to be. My life is a movie. But that's not what I mean. I mean, it's I've lived in Guangzhou and in Vancouver and Tokyo now, and all these the biggest cities on the planet. And it's not really special. Obviously, hundreds of millions of people live in these cities and have very, very regular lives. Anyways, but I've sort of started contemplating this place and trying to Sorry, I had to stop the recording there and listen back to myself saying my life is a movie to see if it was embarrassing. I'm going to leave it in though. But what I was saying was, I started to contemplate this place and try to write something about it to possibly understand it further. Because I find, personally, until I write about it, something that I never really develop any sorts of coherent thoughts about it. It's very easy to spout off and say Tokyo is blah blah blah. But when you write about something, you're being challenged with the question, "What do you mean? Can you prove it? Can you explain that thought?" And that's the challenge at the moment. So I just, over the last little while, I've been trying to put together the first thing that I would formally publish on Tokyo. Actually, a little while ago, I wrote something for the LA Review of Books China channel, which is now discontinued, I think. The website, or whatever the hell you call it, a vertical, I guess you would call it. I don't know if it's a vertical. Anyways, I think it's not a vertical. I think a vertical is that infinite scrolling thing. So it's definitely not that. It was kind of a very lo-fi Web 2.0 thing. Anyways, I wrote about Chinese bookstores in Tokyo for the China channel, which was sort of interesting in a way to think about the links between this city and China. It was, those bookstores in Kanda and Jimbocho are there's places there that you can still go that would have been visited by like Zhou Enlai. He lived in that area. So many Chinese students were coming to Japan in the, say, like after the when did they start coming? I would say like late 1800s, early 1900s. Definitely before the fall of the Qing dynasty, they start coming. And they keep coming basically until relations between the two countries become so bad that they can no longer stay or no longer travel back and forth. There's a lot of really interesting history there that's sort of lost in what comes later. So that was one attempt to write about the city, and in that case, I was really writing about Chinese students and China more so than Tokyo. I didn't really get to the probing deeper into what it really means that those bookstores, those Chinese language bookstores, are here, and what exactly what's the deeper meaning behind them. It's really just saying there were Chinese students who came over, and now there's Chinese immigrants from the mainland and students, and so they have bookstores. I think there's more to look at there. But I've been trying to write something formally. Writing about Japan is very difficult because it's a place that people think they know, that it has a bigger, more complicated construction in the Western imagination. When you talk about China, it's quite simple. It's very simple to write about in a way, because there's this conception of China as sort of like here's the Western imagination of China. It was a place that was communist, and then it became capitalist, but it's still bad, and it's doing bad things to some people who live there, and it's oppressive, but it's actually pretty cool because they have high-speed rail, but it's evil. So it's really easy to add some subtlety, or to sketch a little bit more onto that really, really rough picture that most people have of China. Like that piece I just wrote about ketamine in China. That is surprising to people. Like the idea that China had a synthetic drug boom in the 2000s that was basically sort of tolerated for 10 years. And adding on to that, the idea that the return of the state, the party state under Xi Jinping, was, for many people, in the minds of many people, generally a good thing. So it's really easy to offer those sort of challenging opinions on the country. Japan is harder to shade in, because Japan is also a country that's better at presenting itself to the world. You know, it's a country that actually has somewhat sophisticated apparatuses to project soft power. A lot of, the idea of promoting cool Japan has been ridiculed. The idea that there's like a state body in charge of quote unquote cool Japan as a brand has been ridiculed. But anyways, it's so successful. Anyways, it kind of got lucky that there was, even though like the middle brow, middle class consumer during the 1980s who was into some really cool stuff is gone and has been replaced with all this otaku subculture stuff. That stuff can feed directly into Western subcultural consumer markets. So anyways, Japan is a place that a lot of people think they know in a very detailed way, and there's very, I guess, more nuanced understanding of what it is. But at the same time, there's ignorance of exactly how it works. Like if you ask somebody, tell me, just imagine you're standing on a street corner in Tokyo. What do you see around you? A lot of people in the West could get it quite accurately. If you said the same thing, imagine you're on a street corner in Beijing. What would you see around you? I think they would quite likely get it wrong. They would say there's like a hammer and sickle poster over a Gucci store or whatever, Tiananmen Square or something or other, which isn't really how Beijing looks for the most part. So there's sort of that surface, a complicated surface understanding of what Japan is. But if you ask somebody who's the governing party of Japan, and very few people would say, oh, it's the Liberal Democratic Party. And if you ask them how long were they in power, well, they've been in power for most of the post-war period. And why are they in power? Few people could tell you the story of how the CIA and the State Department, the occupation forces helped install them and rig the electoral system to their benefit. And if in the key points of contemporary Japanese political history, very few people would talk about like 1960s radical politics, which is really important. And there's all these articles about Japanese nationalism, but I think there's very little understanding of what that means. It really means nothing. Japan is it's essentially a colony of the United States, or a client state. And then what does it mean that it's a client state? Well, I mean, that's why the nationalism is completely meaningless, because Japan doesn't have an independent foreign policy. Japan has been, there's always talk about changing the constitution so that Japan could have a standing army again. But in truth, that hasn't happened because Japan doesn't have an independent foreign policy. It doesn't really have independent politics. I mean, the current leadership is to some degree chosen by the United States, and even their domestic policy is determined by what happens in Washington. So the nationalism is mostly quite performative. I mean, they go and visit Yasukuni Shrine where war criminals are enshrined, and refuse to do this or that, offer apologies for whatever, but it doesn't really mean anything. At the same time, this is a city, even whatever relationship they have or how they condemn China or are condemned by China, that's slowly being Sinified, by tourism and immigration. Take that refugee thing, for example. You've seen a million stories. Japan accepts like 11 refugees in whatever year and 12 the next year. I mean, that's a bunch of baloney. They don't accept them as refugees, but they also don't deport them. So they're here anyways. But it's something that they can tout to domestic audience and say, look, we're very tough on refugees, but at the same time still letting them stay. They have very few refugees coming for obvious reasons. And I'm talking about refugees from, let's say, like the Kurds. There's a large Kurdish population living in Saitama, just outside Tokyo. Not really talking about like the Chinese or even Burmese asylum seekers. That's sort of a different story. But even immigration as a immigration policy is that nationalism about where you have a leader like Ishihara, who was the former governor of Tokyo, as an example. He famously railed against, Chinese, Koreans, and Taiwanese. I can't remember the exact word he used. It was some like Sangokujin or something like that. But, I mean, under his leadership and under the leadership of... look at even now, Koike, who is the governor of Tokyo. She is quietly also quite nationalistic. She's done small things like refusing to send the traditional letter of condolence to the group that honors the Koreans who were massacred following the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. So they had an earthquake, and immediately they started butchering Koreans and Chinese. And they also managed to kill some of their countrymen who had funny accents. It's quite a silly story, but Koike refused to send the traditional letter of condolence. But anyways, like on immigration, despite those sort of petty performative nationalist things, this is a city that is becoming less and less Japanese. There's always the stories that coming out about the number of foreign-born residents of the city. But even if you just walk around, you can see that it's a city that is much more multicultural than you would imagine. So that's why I say it's a hard place to write about, because nobody really knows about that stuff unless they're somebody who's particularly interested in the area or have some interest in the country that goes beyond anime or whatever. The demonization of China actually leads in a way to some people having a kind of far too developed knowledge of the politics of it. Nobody could tell you, at least very few people could name what the number one movie was last year in China, or what the best-selling book right now is, or name any major figures or celebrities outside of the people who were famous like 20 years ago. But they know who Xi Jinping is. He has, because the look to China, the lens through which most people look at it is always political. The lens through which most people look at Japan is cultural, or even, I don't know, maybe cultural is too much of a stretch. Maybe pop cultural. Now I don't know if anybody could name what the number one movie last year was in Japan. I don't even know what it is. I couldn't even take a guess at it. Or any major figures from Japan. It's still focused on that kind of subcultural thing. But it's hard to talk about Japan beyond that subcultural stuff, cultural stuff, and kooky stuff. To talk about it beyond Japan is so weird and essentially weird. It's interesting, I think, or a challenge to try to talk about Japan as a normal place. That's sort of the interesting challenge with China too, to talk about China, to force yourself when you write about it, to talk about it as a place that is incredibly normal, to talk about Chinese politics as if they're incredibly normal, which they are. So the challenge with Japan is to also talk about it as if it is incredibly normal and not essentially Japanese or essentially weird in some way. And to also bring in a deeper understanding of the, I want to say politics, but sort of, yeah, I guess that's what I mean. But I don't really mean like who's the prime minister or which parties are in opposition, but politics in a more general sense, not just elite politics, but like on the ground politics. And to talk about it as if, not as if, but to apply the same, to look at it through the same theoretical lens that we look at everything through, or I look at everything through. Again, that's what I try to do with China or with any country, to stick to the theoretical lens that I've, that I've formed, I guess you could say, and apply it consistently to China, apply it consistently to Japan, apply it consistently to wherever. And I think that makes for more interesting writing or more challenging writing. That I think that's the problem with a lot of. Now I'm steering off into another direction here, but I think that's the problem with a lot of writing on China, is that you get very intelligent people who understand their own. If you discussed American politics with them, you would find a lot of common ground. But when they look at China, they are bamboozled. They're easily confused by what they've been told about it and what China itself projects. They don't really think to do their own, to use their own analysis on it, not to think. You hear Xi Jinping is a very bad man who's gotten rid of term limits, but few people would think to, at least on China, would think to say, what does that really mean? What does it mean, looking at it through the way I understand the world, the way I would look at politics in my own country? So when people do that, it's usually taken as sort of a apology for China, to look at it through the same theoretical lens as you would look through anything else, because China is constructed as essentially evil, in the way Japan is constructed as essentially weird. There's a lot of writing about sex work in Japan, and it's not often, if you laid it against writing about sex work in the West by Western writers, it's not really talked about in the same way. It's talked about as like an essentially Japanese thing that is weird and fun. Whereas people writing about sex work in the West, up until a couple of years ago, would imagine it to be, or conceive of it as an exploitative thing, which it no doubt is. But they would never apply that same theoretical peer through the same theoretical lens as Japan and say, what is actually going on here? What does all this mean? What does it mean that women are working in the sex industry? What does it mean that there is a booming sex industry? But behind that, it is. There's a legal sex industry here that certain things are banned, but there's many loopholes. But behind all that is the reality that sex work is sort of a social safety net here for a lot of single mothers and women who are coming from the periphery into the big city. And the rise of it is not connected to anything specifically, essentially Japanese. It's not explained by Japanese culture. It's explained by the turn to austerity after the bubble burst in the 1990s. The slow carving away of the welfare state under a run of liberal democratic leaders in the 1990s and 2000s. That's how you get those fun images on travel shows of colorful nightlife districts. Or even when people talk about, there's a Vice documentary called Schoolgirls for Sale. And again, that's conceived of something that's essentially Japanese, the interest in so the sexual exploitation of girls is not an essentially Japanese thing. That's something that happens everywhere. And in Japan, it's particularly common because of what happened after the bubble burst in the 1990s and the outlook for young women. They didn't have many other options to turn to. Sex work is something that pays well compared to going into a labor market that increasingly offers only informal work on wages that you can't really live on. So that's sort of what I've had in mind trying to write about Japan and Tokyo as of late. And it's also hard because I say writing about Japan, writing about Tokyo, but it's quite hard to write about either one. You know what I mean? To write about any country in the most general terms is not particularly interesting, and it doesn't tell you a lot about what's actually happening there. But to get super specific and super local also cuts off a lot of people, get less interested. If you say this is going to be an article about how Japan is whatever, it's more interesting than saying this is an article about one specific area in one specific ward of one specific half of the city. If you write about Japan, you can't write about Japan. You need to write about a city within it. And if you write about a city within it, there's going to be a big difference writing about Tokyo if you wrote about Nakameguro versus writing about Kinshicho versus writing about Minami Senju versus writing about Kawasaki, which is technically not in Tokyo, but it's in Kanagawa. But and it's very different if you write about the residents of each place, and even within that, So what I'm saying is it's extremely difficult, and it might be an insurmountable challenge. But that's what I've been doing the last little while. I trying to write about a piece that's sort of structured as a travel log, traveling between one part of the city in East Tokyo, like an East Tokyo neighborhood that's famous for love hotels, and traveling from there to Aoyama, which is a big luxury real estate neighborhood in, I guess you call it central Tokyo, and sort of trying to uncover who the elite of the country are, and how they are reforming the neighborhoods like that one in East Tokyo in their image. Talking about the rise of a new elite who are going to challenge old politics, who are these people who are sort of connected out into the world, or would like to be, and are sort of stifled. Who these are the people who would like to take the covers off what all that performative nationalism is covering up. So instead of saying we accepted 12 refugees, look, isn't that swell? They would like to say, oh, we accepted 2,700 Syrian refugees. Help us celebrate. And they're the people who've been quietly remaking Japan. They're the ones who are pushing for more immigration reform, for example, and pushing for casinos to be built to attract more Chinese tourists. They're the people who are in charge of Rakuten and SoftBank and, tourism companies and real estate companies, the people who want to revitalize the Japanese economy by opening it up again and liberalizing it even further, opening it up to investment. The Olympics is a big part of that, of selling Japan as a stable destination for investment. So that's what I've been up to. And I don't know, it remains to be seen if it will come to anything, or if it will be embarrassing. But I won't know until I actually write it and not just see the reaction, but see how it looks to myself.